Isabella once believed that love was the only currency that mattered in the grand market of life. She had married Leo with a heart full of dreams, seeing in his kind eyes a wealth that no bank could ever hold. They lived in a small, humble cottage where laughter was their most valuable possession and shared moments were their finest art. In those early days, the simplicity of their existence felt like a beautiful, hand-woven tapestry. She would listen to him speak of his ideas, his grand plans for inventions that seemed to her like poetry whispered to the moon. She held on to the belief that his brilliance would soon be recognized and their life would blossom like a rose in springtime. But as the seasons turned, the fabric of their simple life began to feel thin and worn. Isabella, who had grown up surrounded by the quiet hum of prosperity, started to notice the things they lacked. Her friends wore fine silks and sparkling jewels, speaking of travels to distant, sun-kissed lands. Isabella, in her modest dresses, felt the sting of their polite, pitying glances. The laughter in their little cottage grew quieter, replaced by the heavy silence of unpaid bills and the constant, nagging worry about the future. Love, she began to realize with a sinking heart, could not mend a leaking roof or put a feast upon a barren table. It was a beautiful, but ultimately powerless, sentiment against the harsh realities of the world. The man she had married, once a beacon of hopeful ambition, now seemed like a ship lost in a fog of fruitless dreams. His hands, once gentle and creative, were now perpetually stained with grease and oil from tinkering with machines that never quite worked. Each failed invention, each rejected proposal, chipped away not only at his spirit, but at her patience. She saw not a struggling genius, but a man content with mediocrity, a man who could not give her the life she secretly craved. The whispers of society, the silent judgment in her father's eyes, all echoed in her mind. Her love, once a mighty fortress, was crumbling brick by brick under the relentless siege of poverty. Disappointment settled in her heart like a cold, persistent winter. It was a slow, creeping chill that froze the warmth she once felt for Leo. She started to see his optimism not as a strength, but as a foolish denial of their grim situation. His gentle reassurances that everything would be all right began to sound like hollow echoes in an empty hall. The life she had chosen, a life of love over luxury, now felt like a terrible mistake, a youthful folly she was desperate to correct. The glimmer of love had faded, and in its place was a dark and growing resentment, a yearning for something more, something tangible, something that glittered like gold. The breaking point arrived on a cold, rainy evening, the kind of night that mirrors the gloom within a troubled soul. Isabella stood in their small living room, the air thick with unspoken words and the scent of damp earth. She looked at Leo, who was sketching another one of his impossible designs, his face illuminated by a single flickering lamp. All the frustration, all the silent bitterness she had harbored for months finally boiled over. "I cannot do this anymore, Leo," she said, her voice sharp and brittle, cutting through the quiet hum of the rain. "I cannot live like this. This is not a life. It is merely a waiting room for a future that will never arrive." Leo looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and hurt, the pencil falling from his hand. He saw not the woman he loved, but a stranger with a face carved from ice. He tried to speak, to offer promises he still believed in, but she would not listen. "Your dreams are empty, Leo," she continued, her words like stones. "They are clouds without rain. I need more. I deserve more." With a final, resolute gesture, she pointed to the door. "Leave," she commanded, the single word hanging in the air, heavy and irrevocable. "Take your worthless drawings and your false hopes and leave this house." He stood there for a moment, a statue of disbelief, before slowly gathering his things and walking out into the unforgiving night, leaving behind a silence more profound than any storm. For a time, Isabella felt a sharp, exhilarating sense of freedom. She had cut the anchor that was holding her down. She moved back into her father's grand house, a world of polished wood and quiet servants, and tried to forget the man who had shared her humble cottage. But life, as it often does, had its own plans. 2 years after she had closed the door on Leo, another door closed forever. Her father passed away suddenly, leaving behind a legacy that was far more fragile than anyone knew. The family company, a titan of industry for generations, was revealed to be in serious trouble, weighed down by debt and poor decisions. The world Isabella had reclaimed so ruthlessly began to crumble around her. The comfort of wealth was replaced by the cold fear of losing it all. The parties and social gatherings ceased, replaced by tense meetings with accountants and lawyers whose faces were grim masks of bad news. The friends who had once admired her now offered only whispers of sympathy, their pity now genuine and all the more cutting. Isabella found herself trapped in a new kind of poverty, one not of empty pockets, but of a collapsing empire. She was the captain of a sinking ship, a vessel her father had built, and she had no idea how to keep it afloat. When Leo walked out into the rain that fateful night, he carried more than a suitcase of clothes and a portfolio of drawings. He carried the weight of a broken heart and the sting of failure. For weeks he wandered in a daze, the world a blur of grey streets and indifferent faces. Every closed door and every dismissive glance reminded him of Isabella's final words. They were a cruel but powerful fuel. He could have surrendered to despair, letting his spirit drown in the sea of his sorrow. But somewhere in the depths of his being, a flicker of defiance sparked into a flame. He would not be the man she had cast aside. He would become the man he always knew he could be. His journey began not with a grand stroke of luck, but with relentless, back-breaking work. He took a job in a grimy machine shop, his hands becoming calloused, his nights spent in a tiny, rented room. But he was not just working. He was learning. He watched, he listened, and he absorbed every detail about mechanics, engineering, and the practical business of turning ideas into reality. During the day, he fixed the machines of others. At night, he refined his own. He poured all his energy, all his pain, and all his ambition into one of his designs, a revolutionary new process for energy efficiency that he had once tried to explain to an uninterested Isabella. The turning point came when he found a small, forward-thinking investor who saw not a poor, heartbroken man, but a genius with a fire in his eyes. The man did not offer him pity, he offered him a chance. With a modest seed of capital, Leo built his first prototype. It was not a flight of fancy or a cloud without rain, it was a marvel of engineering that worked flawlessly. It was more efficient, more powerful, and cheaper to produce than anything on the market. The success of that single invention was like a key that unlocked 100 doors. Orders poured in, and his small operation grew exponentially. In just 2 short years, Leo transformed himself. He was no longer the gentle dreamer from the cottage. He was a titan of industry, a visionary whose name was whispered with respect in boardrooms across the country. He built an empire not on inheritance, but on ingenuity and sheer force of will. He learned the language of money, of power, of acquisitions. Yet he never forgot the woman who had set him on this painful, yet transformative path. He had followed the news of her father's passing and the subsequent decline of her family's company, watching from a distance as the world she had chosen began to fall apart. The day of the final board meeting was grey and bleak, a perfect match for Isabella's mood. She sat at the head of the long, polished table in her father's office, a place that now felt like a tomb. Before her lay the final, desperate offer from an anonymous buyer, the only option left to save the company from complete collapse. It was a humiliating surrender. The door opened and a man walked in, flanked by 2 sharp-suited lawyers. He moved with an easy confidence, an aura of power that seemed to fill the entire room. Isabella looked up, her eyes weary, and her breath caught in her throat. It was Leo. He was not the man she had banished into the rain. This man was different. His simple clothes were replaced by a perfectly tailored suit that spoke of quiet, immense wealth. The hopeful, almost pleading look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a calm, unreadable gaze that held the confidence of a king surveying his domain. There was no anger on his face, no hint of revenge, only a cool, detached professionalism that was more unnerving than any open hostility. He was not the beggar at her door. He was the buyer of her entire world, the anonymous investor who held her family's legacy in the palm of his hand. "Leo," she whispered, the name a ghost on her lips. He simply nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible acknowledgement, and took a seat opposite her. "Isabella," he replied, his voice even and steady, betraying no emotion. The room was silent, the air crackling with the weight of 2 years of history, of love and loss, of failure and triumph. He slid the papers across the table. "I believe you have my offer," he said, his tone purely business. "It is more than generous considering the circumstances. It will clear all your debts and leave you with a comfortable sum. The company, however, will be mine." Isabella stared at the man before her, a storm of emotions raging within her. Here was the success she had always craved, embodied in the very man she had deemed a failure. He had not come back to beg for her love, or to gloat about his victory. He had come back to conduct a transaction, to purchase the remnants of her life as one might purchase a piece of antique furniture. In that moment, the full, crushing irony of her choices crashed down upon her. She had traded love for the promise of wealth, only to lose both. He had lost her love, but in its place he had built an empire. The roles were not just reversed, they were completely and irrevocably rewritten. She was the one left with nothing,